We're almost done going through that startup process. And I know that this is a lot of new knowledge to digest, but it's important to have an idea of the big picture and of what happens here in general. So I left when I pointed at this app component, which seems to be a somewhat important component in our Angular app. Well, therefore, let's have a look at it. And remember that we are importing it from ./app component, so from this file. Now in here, what you can see is, again, a class which we export with that app component name we are importing in app module. And just as our app module, the app component has a decorator. But here it's not the ng module decorator, but the component decorator, which again is imported from Angular, from the Angular framework, here from Angular/core. And if you're wondering how you can know from which part of Angular you can import what, it's basically the same set of features all the time, so you will learn it throughout this course, throughout this refresher, of course. Now, we add this decorator to this class for a similar reason as we added add-ng-module to this class in the app module, to provide metadata behind the scenes, which allows Angular to treat this code in a certain way and execute it correctly in our browser, so to say. Because you always have to keep in mind that we write the code here in a relatively structured and easy to read way. This is not code that will run in the browser, but it is code that is transpiled to code that runs in the browser. And therefore, we, for example, need to add certain metadata as we do with this add component decorator. The add component decorator takes a JavaScript object to configure this component. And here we configure three important parts. The first part is the so-called selector. And this is basically your own HTML tag by which you will be able to use this component in your application. And you see it's app root here. Now, before I talk about the other two parts, let's for a second check where we actually use app root. Well, maybe we do in our single page in index.html. And indeed we do. If you check this file, you see app root being thrown into our body here. Now, Angular scans this document body for us, you could say, and it scans it for this selector. Now, it does this because in app module, we defined the app component as a bootstrap, so as a root component for the application. It does not scan index.html for any other component we might create. We only have one here, but we can and will create more components soon. It only scans it for the selector of app component because this was added to Bootstrap. And yes, you could add multiple components here. This is advanced though, and typically you only have one root component. Other components are added differently. So this is why the selector is important. Because of that selector and the selector matching this tag here, Angular is able to mount our root component in this place in our HTML file. Now, this component does not just have a selector. It also needs some definition of which HTML code Angular should actually render when it mounts this component. And that is defined in the so-called template of this component. Here, we have the template URL key, which points at a file, a HTML file, which contains the HTML code for this component. And here, this is this app component HTML code. If we have a look at this, we see a bunch of normal HTML tags here. And this is actually the HTML code which is responsible for what you're seeing here. A h1 tag, an image, and then an unordered list, for example. Well, that is exactly what you can find here. A h1 tag, an image, and an unordered list. Now, it's important to understand that this is not a HTML page which is shipped to the browser and just rendered like this. Instead, Angular behind the scenes parses this and creates a couple of JavaScript instructions that render these HTML elements whenever this component gets mounted to the DOM. And you can check this by going back to your page and inspecting your page source with View Page Source here in Chrome. What you will see is that you only have app root in here. You see none of the other HTML elements, which you can see here in your app component HTML code. This is the page, the HTML page we got back from the server. So it's not containing all these HTML elements. That changes, however, if you inspect your DOM, so the actually rendered DOM. There, you can see all this extra content inside of app root. Here is app root, and inside of that you got that h2 tag and the div with the h1 tag and so on. So here you can see that is the content that is rendered, but not the content that is initially loaded. And the reason for this difference is that Angular is just JavaScript that runs on your loaded page, and then it will render all this content, all this template content here, dynamically. Now, last but not least, our component also can take some styling, and here we use style URLs, which actually holds an array of paths to CSS files that should be applied to this component's template. So any HTML code in there can be styled with regular CSS written in this app component CSS file. Here we have no styles, but you could add your own one, and by default, the styles you set up here only apply to elements in this component. So if we add a h1 styling here and we give this a red color, then all h1 tags in this component will be red. But if we had another component which also uses h1, there it would not be red, because the styles defined in the component style sheet are scoped to this component. So that is how the Angular app starts and how these core features, modules, and components work together. Now that was a lot of talking. Let's now create our own components and dive a bit deeper into how Angular works in its basics.